Hey guys, welcome back to What the Fat. Today I have on a brilliant MD, kind of contrary to most medical doctors that I've talked into the space about, but he is an incredible guy. I've been watching a lot of the videos, and every time I hear someone talk about carnivore, like his name keeps popping up, and I'm like, I gotta get this guy on the freaking podcast. So, Dr. Paul Saladino, welcome to the show, man.
Man, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on, Ryan. It's fun to talk about this stuff. I don't ever want to stop talking about it.
I love it, man. So can you tell everyone a little bit about your background? What got you into this? What kind of got you going to go get eventually your MD?
Yeah, so, my dad's a doc. I grew up seeing medicine when I was younger. After college, I was pretty burned out. I went to college at William & Mary on the East Coast. I studied chemistry and biology. I had some great professors. And, after college, I took about 6 years off and ended up just gallivanting around the American West, climbing mountains and skiing in the backcountry. And I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail one year from Mexico to Canada. So for 6 years, I was a vagabond. And eventually, I think that after my brain had a little bit of time to rest after the rigors of college and I was ready to go back to school, I looked at my dad's life and I thought, oh man, he's a great man. He really got taken over by medicine and really martyred himself for internal medicine and was just too busy throughout his life. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to go to PA school. So my first decision was PA school. I ended up going to George Washington University and did PA degree and then worked as a PA in cardiology for 4 years. But what I quickly discovered when I was working as a PA was that something about it didn't feel right. I just wasn't satisfied. And within the first year or two of being a PA in cardiology, I just realized that I wasn't getting to the root cause of the problems. And that I had been trained on all these complex medications and all this complex cardiac physiology and cardiac pharmacology. And I was giving people statins and beta blockers and ACE inhibitors, and I could affect these physiologic parameters well, but I really wanted to know what was causing it. I remember actually even before I went to college, sitting at like the dinner table with my dad, probably when I was in middle school, saying, hey dad, what causes atherosclerosis? What causes plaque buildup in the arteries? And he said, nobody knows. It's your job to find out. And I think that kind of question stuck with me, and that line of questioning has always stuck with me. I think that as a physician, I've been potentially to the point of being, pathologically obsessed with the idea of what causes something. I'm just not satisfied as a physician doing my work unless I can at least try to approach the root cause of an illness. So as a PA, I quickly realized, hey, what I'm doing is great. I'm working with awesome physicians, but I'm just treating the symptoms with these medications, and I want to know what causes atherosclerosis. I want to know what causes hypertension. I want to know what causes thyroid disease. And I also was then beginning to realize that the way that our medical system treats illness is via very balkanized. We subdivide the pie into different specialties. We say, you're a cardiologist, you're an endocrinologist. I was even told from time to time, just stay within the heart box. And that just bothered me. I thought, even as a PA, I realized it's all connected. It's got to be. So I went back to medical school at the University of Arizona, which has a strong focus in integrative medicine. At that time, I got interested in functional medicine, which is really just root cause medicine from, a science-based perspective. And I went, through medical school and then residency now, which I'm just about to finish in like 2 months from being done in my 4-year residency in psychiatry. In medical school, I got very interested in mental health and connections between the gut and the brain and connections between the brain and the rest of the body. So, but I definitely see myself as a physician first, and I like to think about everything is connected. And I think that, my practice in functional medicine is not limited to psychiatry. It's all connected, and I see people who are having all sorts of problems. And particularly, I have a fascination with the depression and the anxiety. They're often so reflective of systemic underlying things. So it's been a circuitous path.
That's incredible, man. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You're almost at the final road there. That's incredible, man.
Long road to private practice.
Right. So when did this idea of, maybe let's approach this from a nutritional standpoint, and maybe this concept of like, eating extremely low carb, and for you it's like eating just meat. When did that concept kind of resonate? Like when did that start to come about?
That's been sort of growing in my mind since medical school. I think one of the most radical notions that Western medicine needs to accept at the outset is that diet affects disease. And whether or not we're talking about a ketogenic diet or a paleo diet or a vegan diet or a nose-to-tail carnivore diet, there are connections between the food we eat and the diseases we see. And if Western medicine can begin to accept that, I think that we'll see a real sea change in the overall paradigm. So throughout my schooling, whether it was PA school or medical school especially, and then residency, I've always thought, going back to that original question, what causes disease? I'm pretty sure that our environment, specifically our diet, is a really big part of that, a really, really big part of that. So I've always been thinking, what is the most appropriate diet for humans? Are there different diets for every individual human? Is there one ancestral diet that all people can eat and some people can build upon that? It's been this really fascinating thing for me to kind of turn over in my mind. I remember hearing a lecture from Georgia Eade when I was in medical school. She's a psychiatrist on the East Coast, so this was probably 7 or 8 years ago, and she was talking about how she had patients who were sensitive to things that we often consider to be very helpful, like onions or garlic, or foods that were within what I would consider to be paleo. I mean, I've been eating, so I ate probably an organic paleo diet for the last 12 to 13 years, but that was really radical. I thought, oh, this is crazy to think that some of these plants might actually be triggering issues for people. So I kind of turned that around in my mind for a little while, and I thought, what, that makes a lot of sense that plants don't want to get eaten. Plants are rooted in space. They can't run away from us. And I think no botanist or ethnobotanist or zoologist would argue that plants have evolved defense mechanisms. Plants have evolved toxins, and that's just how the plant species have stayed alive throughout millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, predating human and mammal evolution. They've stayed alive by developing plant toxins. So that concept was pretty cool at the time, and I've just kind of progressed with that. It got in my mind then, the seed was planted, and I kind of went back to like autoimmune paleo. And then really within the last year, I've just, for whatever reason, it all kind of crystallized. And I thought, wait a minute. Why am I eating the roots and seeds and stems and leaves of plants? And I think that, listening to people like Jordan Peterson talk about the diet and Sean Baker talk about the diet on Joe Rogan, I was like, what, this is really cool. And as I'm sure you and many of the listeners will have heard, that the beginnings of the carnivore diet in the last 2 to 3 years really began with incredible anecdotes like Michaela Peterson, Jordan Peterson on large platforms saying that they had autoimmune disease that resolved when they cut out plants. And I thought, that makes total sense from what I was thinking in medical school. And autoimmunity has always been something I'm super interested in. So this idea that the body attacks itself, I see autoimmunity as really synonymous with chronic inflammation. So many of the diseases we treat now are autoimmune in nature. I just really believe they're autoimmune and that they're then chronic inflammatory diseases. And so anything that positively affected diseases that were autoimmune, chronic inflammation, that were seen as recalcitrant or untreatable, that was like the holy grail to me. I was like, that is cool. I want to look into it. So that was really the genesis of the last year, sort of diving into this world of what if, this is the hugest what if, I think in nutrition of our generation, what if plants are not good for humans? What if plants, and is it, maybe they're not good for every human, maybe they're not good for some humans, but what if plants are triggering autoimmunity for some people, for every person? Like, that is a radical concept, and that is a very fascinating rabbit hole at the bottom of which I find myself right now.
And it really is a rabbit hole. And it's interesting because I see the same thing. My mom has Crohn's. And so she has Crohn's disease, and I notice it all the time with her. She can't have onions. She can't have any of these things. And when she goes on a ketogenic diet, for her, and the challenge for her, because I've tried to approach her with hey, what if we just go carnivore? She hates meat, and I'm like, all right, well, how do we get around this? So it's slowly how do we create a as close as possible to carnivore approach as humanly possible? And she finds great success with it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I've encountered that a few times. Maybe we should just touch on that for listeners. Without sounding sexist, 100% of the clients and patients I've encountered who don't like meat are women. And I don't know if it's conditioning or zinc deficiency and inadequate stomach acid leading to inadequate digestion. But I do fear that it's conditioning. And I think that, maybe people don't like meat for ethical reasons, and we can talk about the ethics of eating meat. But that is a unique challenge when I have had a number of clients who I really think would benefit from a carnivore diet. And it's not something that I use reflexively in my clients, but generally it's definitely the thing that I found to be the most efficacious for the vast majority of my clients, whether they're autoimmune or whatever. But getting people to take a step back and think, what is it about the meat that they don't like? Is it conditioning? Do they not want to hurt animals? Is it that we've become divorced from hunting animals? I mean, to me, it's a strange concept. We've been hunting animals for a million years. And that was, arguably what made us human. Plants are not what made us human. Plants are not what progressed our evolution. So we've become so separated from that. And when people say I don't like animals, I think, wow, like if we were in the same tribe, you wouldn't survive. You have to eat animals. That's just what humans do.
Right. No, you're 100% right. And I think for her, it's more of like she doesn't like the taste of it. She's around me and my dad who eat copious amounts of meat. So it has nothing to do with like the ethics. But you bring up a really, really good point. Something I actually want to jump into and I think it was Jordan Peterson who talked about this on Joe's podcast. But someone talks about the ethics of meat. This was like a mind-blowing concept to even me, because I never had challenges or troubles with that, but I always had people who would come up to me and they're like, oh, but like you have a dog who you care a lot about, like why would you go out and have meat? And then someone brought up the concept, like if you only knew how many animals got killed when we do cropping or when we like harvest corn that you're doing, like the amount of rabbits and mice and all those things. So you're basically saying you can't say that you value animals' lives. You're putting a priority and saying I value this cow's life more than I value this rabbit's life or this mice's life. That's the only argument you can make. I don't think you can make the argument it's an animal thing. Is that right?
I totally agree.
Okay.
I think the number is 3.6 billion animals, or million. It's either million or billion, are killed per year with these crop rotations. So there's a name for it. It's like crop kills, or I forget the name for it. But it's either million or billion. But it's a lot of zeros. 3.6 million or 3.6 billion. It can't be billion, but probably million. 3.6 million animals. Some large number of animals are killed every year as we're harvesting crops. So that is the first piece of it. In fact, animal agriculture kills less animals than the actual harvesting of grain and plants and things. And then there's also this really fundamental issue, which gets back to what we were saying, which is, it's a very privileged, maybe that's not the right word. It's just a very misunderstood position, in my opinion. I respect everyone's opinion, but it's a very misunderstood, misinformed position for a human to say, like, I don't want to kill an animal. It's like, wait a minute, like, there's a really great book that I like. It's called The Tracker by Tom Brown. Are you familiar with this book?
I've heard of it. I've heard of this. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tom Brown is great. So he is a guy who grew up in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and he is a tracker. But he grew up as a young boy, according to the story, which is supposedly true, apprenticed to an Apache Indian elder who lived nearby and was the grandfather of one of Tom Brown's sons, or Tom Brown's friends. So these two boys grew up. They had this like idyllic story of growing up under the tutelage of this Apache Indian who was traditionally trained. And so these are, in the 1950s, 1960s, these sort of, different era boys becoming teenagers, growing up with this Apache Indian, learning the ways of a Native American from a previous lifetime, right? And, they learned to hunt and they learned to stalk and track animals. But when he tells a story in the book that when he was 12 years old, he had to kill his first animal. Maybe it was even 9 or 12 years old. He killed his first animal. And he stalked this deer, and he was in a tree, and he jumped down and he stabbed the deer with a knife. And it was a small baby deer that had like a lame leg that he'd been tracking for days. And he killed the animal, and he's bringing it back to camp, and he sees the Apache Indian, who they call grandfather, and he's weeping. And he says to him, I feel so bad that I killed this animal. And I'm going to mess up the paraphrasing here, but the grandfather figure says to him, when you understand that the life of a blade of grass is the same as the life of a deer or an animal, that all life is the same and all life is connected, you'll understand this. In order for something to live, something else must die. This is the way of life. And I just thought that was so interesting. Like, death is sacred, and in order for something to live, something else must die. That is the way of life. You know, in order for an herbivorous animal to live, they are going to eat a plant. You know, they will often kill that plant in order to live. I was just listening to a video last night. Miki Ben-Dor, who's an anthropologist, was talking about elephants in Africa killing baobab trees to create savanna. And so the animals are actually killing these trees to create an environment that is, you know, useful for them. They may not be eating the baobab, but, you know, there's animals eat plants, other animals eat each other. You know, I mean, we don't look at the lion and say, that is so wrong. How could the lion eat the zebra? That's just what they do. And I think that we've become divorced from this notion and maybe lost the spirituality around the harvesting of animals. And without sounding woo-woo, this like circle of life and this connection that we have with nature, because we go to the grocery store and all we do is we pick up a dead animal and a piece of meat. We don't have to like kill the animal and go through all the spiritual, or at least the practices around killing an animal that remind us how fortunate we are to be alive. But we're all benefiting from that, whether we're eating chicken eggs or we're eating steak or we're eating kale. You know, obviously I have thoughts about which of those will lead to more optimal health, but you know, there is, you know, some life form had to die or, you know, had to be hurt in order to get that food. You know, people would say, oh, you don't kill the kale plant when you take the leaf. And it's like, yeah, but if you basically kill the kale plant if you take all of its leaves. Like, it's going to die, you know, like in order for something to live, something else must die. Animals eat plants, they kill the plant. That's how it goes. Animals kill each other. So this idea that we shouldn't be killing animals is like, wait a minute, you're a human, you know, we definitely need to harvest animals. I just think that for me, it reminds me that I want to be connected to that animal and understand that I need to harvest the animal respectfully. Hunting kind of does that for me and reminds me when I've done bow hunting in the past and actually killed an animal myself, it is a much greater reminder when you see this beautiful animal. I didn't get sad. I just thought, oh man, I have a responsibility to be a good human because this animal is going to nourish me. And I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily think this in my last moment, but if I'm out running and a cougar decides to eat me, it's like, well, here's a circle of life, man. Like, I've been eating animals my whole life. Like, I'm dinner for this guy. Like, it's just, I mean, I surf a lot, right? And I'm always like, well, I hope the shark doesn't eat me because, you know, I'm pretty sure it wants to eat a seal. I'm pretty sure a seal is going to taste better than I will. But at some level, like, in order for something to live, something else must die. And that's the way of life. That is the beautiful part of life. And to say, like, we shouldn't be killing animals, I think just kind of loses our connection in the grand scheme of things.
Right. And that's a great perspective. I mean, the first time I went hunting and my first deer that I ever got,
right,
it was like one of those moments where you really appreciate it. My friend Mike Mutzel, like, he has a whole farm and he like raises these hogs and he's like, I'm going to have to slaughter them. Like, they're like part of his family, and he's like, eventually they'll become like my dinner. And so I love your perspective on that. And people often lose sight, I think, of like what actually happens in the wild because we're so tamed in our little comfortable culture. There's actually a really good page. I've never admitted this before, but a couple of my close friends know this, but there's a page on Instagram that's called Nature is Metal. And it literally has some of the craziest stuff. Like, it's something that you're like, oh, like that really happens. But you continue to watch it because you're like, wow, it's literally a lion hunting a zebra, and like in real time you're watching it kill it, devour it, and do it. But you're like that's life. That's reality.
That's what we do. And you know, for me, it makes me think like I want to get back to just appreciating the spiritual connection of killing animals. You know, like I want to have more gratitude when I eat animals. So I want to hunt more and just say like, wow, like, and I think eventually what it comes back to for me is this idea that it is a responsibility to live well. You know, this animal gave its life for me. I better not be an asshole. You know, I'm not going to yell at a guy. Like, I better be a good person, man. It's like, that's just what it comes down to for me. It's like, you better be a good quality human because you are, by existing on the planet, you are using other resources, you are taking other lives. So make your life the best expression that it can be, because there's no way around that.
I love that, man. And that kind of leads into the next thing I want to talk about. We were talking a little bit. I think we have a mutual friend that you actually had a debate with on a podcast before, but he was bringing up a lot of questions. He's more into like the if it fits your macros. And you were kind of bringing up some great points, by the way, some incredible things that I want to take a little bit dive into. But one of the things you talked about, which was really interesting, I think a lot of people leave this out when they talk about carnivore. And I think a lot of times people lose sight, and this is one of the caveats that I've talked about with people with, hey, just be careful if you're doing this on carnivore. Like, I don't think carnivore should be, let's go to Wendy's, remove the bun, and get that for every single meal and eat that all the time. Like, you're saying, no, let's eat head to tail. Here's how to incorporate things in. So can you talk a little bit about that head to tail approach and why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, this kind of goes back to the ancestral norms that we've lost. We live in 2019, but everything I've ever read, everything I've learned about anthropology and indigenous cultures, and everything I've seen suggests that our ancestors ate the whole animal. You're not going to waste an animal, and why would you? It has nutrients, it has calories, macronutrients and micronutrients, which will lead toward your greater success in your life. So you're not going to waste an animal. You don't kill a deer and just eat the backstrap, the tenderloin. You don't kill a deer and just eat the muscle meat. You're going to eat the whole thing as much as you possibly can. You're probably not going to eat the antlers, but you're going to crack open the bones and get the bone marrow. You're going to crack open the skull and eat the brain. And this sounds gross to our, gentrified, ideals right now, but there are unique nutrients in various compartments of the animal. I've said this on my Instagram, that animals represent the most highly bioavailable forms of all the nutrients a human needs to function optimally. If you could design a multivitamin for a human, the optimal multivitamin for a human would be an animal. That is the ultimate, that has everything that a human needs to function as the best human it can be. So you're going to eat the whole multivitamin, right? You're going to eat the brain, which is going to have omega-3 and DHA, which is one of the omega-3 fatty acids. You're going to eat the eyeballs, which have vitamin A, in the back of the eyeball. You're going to eat the tongue, which is more collagenous. You're going to eat the connective tissue, which is higher in glycine. You're going to eat the muscle meat, which has lots of good nutrients, but often gets emphasized at the exclusion of all these other tissues. You're going to eat the liver. The liver is a great source of vitamin A, biotin, folate, copper to balance the zinc. We can talk about all that. But if you just eat the muscle meat, we're not going to get everything a human needs to function. Muscle meat is not the multivitamin. Muscle meat is like half of the multivitamin. And the other half of the multivitamin is connective tissue, bone marrow, liver, brain, omega-3. We need all the pieces of it. So eating nose to tail, you're getting all these pieces. I mean, this is what's so interesting is that in 2019, we have a great understanding, not a perfect understanding, but we have a pretty incredible understanding of what humans need nutritionally. You can look up online, what are all the vitamins and minerals a human needs? What is everything a human needs? And if you look at an animal, they're not all in the muscle meat. They're just not. Like, everything a human needs is not in our muscles. There's no calcium, there's no vitamin A, there's no folate, there's no biotin, or very small amounts. There's not a lot of manganese, and there's really no copper in the muscle meat. Those things are all found in other places in the animal. So if we eat nose to tail, we're going to be getting everything we need, and we're going to be getting this ultimate multivitamin. This is perhaps one of the downsides of a carnivore diet, is that you have to construct it intelligently. You have to construct it intentionally. I think a carnivore diet has many incredible benefits in that it cuts out all of the superfluous plant matter that has these associated toxins, which we can talk about. But the downside of a carnivore diet is that if you don't construct it well, people could develop nutrient deficiencies. And that's sort of what I'm trying to educate people on. It appears to be very beneficial, like we were talking about earlier, for people with autoimmune issues, probably because of the elimination of plants and plant toxins, lectins, oxalates. We can talk about all that. But I'm worried that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see people developing deficiencies, and that is going to hurt the movement in something that could be very beneficial for people. But if we add organ meats, connective tissue, bones, bone marrow, and omega-3 sources, iodine sources, then we will get everything we need. And that's just sort of like reverse engineering a human. What do we get? So this is, the flip side is this is the advantage of a mixed diet, like a paleo diet, is you're eating from more, diverse food array. So you're less likely to have a nutrient deficiency, less likely. You still could have a nutrient deficiency. It's very possible to still not get enough copper on a paleo diet, but things like mushrooms have copper, other foods have copper, so you may not need to eat liver. But as I've hinted at, the problem for some people, maybe all of us, is that with the plants comes anti-nutrients, and those are more or less of a problem depending on the person. So it's just this sort of balance and figuring out where you get all your nutrients. But it's totally knowable what nutrients a human needs now to function optimally. Almost, I don't want to suggest that we know everything, but we know most of it.
Right. And I love that you're educating on that, because I do see a lot of people in the carnivore space who are going out and doing just the Wendy's Baconator, just do this every meal. And I love that you're being a voice and going out and talking more about hey, there's actually a well-formulated way to do this. So one of the things I want to talk about, because I just got done. I just did 45 days of carnivore, and I tend to eat closer to that way as it is. So one of the things I realized was hey, Danny Vega actually told me hey, incorporate in more heart, incorporate in more liver. What are some other things? And for me, it was getting over the taste of that, and that was easy. Just add salt and put it in with some beef, and it was fine. What are some of the other things besides liver, which you could find probably at your grocery store on a farm if you're close to one? What are some other things you would recommend for someone other than just muscle meat?
So, okay, we can break it down for people and tell them exactly how to do this. I also have a YouTube video called The Ultimate Guide to Carnivore, in which I kind of break this down too.
Perfect.
So we start with muscle meat as the basis of the diet, and people will probably want to eat, 1 to 2 to 3 pounds of muscle meat. 3 pounds is kind of on the high end, but some amount of muscle meat per day, and that can be ribeye, that can be steak, New York steak, that can be ground beef. And I think that a grass-fed source of the muscle meat is the best source. And that kind of gets back to the issue, do you want to eat grain-fed meat? Do you want to support grain-fed industry at Wendy's, et cetera? I'm not a fan of the 16 In-N-Out burgers or the Wendy's thing. I just think that for a lot of reasons, that's giving people the wrong idea. I agree. So on top of the muscle meat, there is liver. So there's organ meats. We talked about that. I would recommend that people eat 2 to 3 ounces of liver a day. Because if you look at the nutrient content of 2 to 3 ounces of liver a day, you're getting an incredibly robust amount of riboflavin, folate, gets pretty close to the RDA, although there's lots of debate about whether the RDAs are relevant, but you're getting a good amount of folate, a very robust amount of biotin, choline, copper, and 2 to 3 ounces of liver a day. I just did a post on Instagram about liver right before we got on this call. I don't have concerns about vitamin A toxicity for people eating that amount of liver, especially in the setting of adequate other fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin K2, which are very rich in animal foods. So you have muscle meat, you have liver, and then the next thing is probably going to be the omega-3 source. So people should probably either be eating wild salmon or salmon roe. So I love salmon roe. It's a phospholipid DHA. DHA is one of the omega-3 fatty acids, and this phospholipid form of DHA is more absorbable, more able to cross the blood-brain barrier than triglyceride or ethyl ester forms of DHA. So it's been shown to be more highly bioavailable, and things like krill oil and salmon roe are good sources of phospholipid DHA. The caveat about krill oil and most of the processed fish oils is that they're often oxidized, and you have to be very careful and really look into this. I posted on my Instagram about a study done by Bart Kay, who I've had a conversation with on my YouTube, where he actually looked, I think he did HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography, of the fish oil supplements, and many of them did have significant levels of lipid peroxides, which we know are not a great thing. It happens, but we want to avoid it as much as possible. So we have muscle meat, we have organ meats, liver, 2 to 3 ounces a day, however you want to get it. We have omega-3 source, which is fish, either salmon roe or wild-caught salmon, a low-mercury fish. And the omega-3 source will often give people an iodine source. So you need an omega-3/iodine source. So some people may be getting an omega-3 source without getting iodine. If they're doing something like cod liver oil, you're not going to get iodine. So you have to make sure you're getting iodine as well. So eating salmon roe or fish will give you those at the same juncture. Then you have to look at, I would say, a connective tissue source. This gets into methionine and glycine. And The idea here gets into some complex biochemistry. The idea here is that muscle meat is high in methionine. Muscle meat has 2% methionine and about 7 to 8% glycine. If you look at collagen, collagen is about 0.9% methionine and 23% glycine. So there's a real differential in the amount of methionine and glycine in muscle meat and connective tissue. And when we combine them, it starts to look for probably what's an ideal ratio of methionine to glycine, but it's going to be individual based on individual physiology. The concern that I have is that by only eating muscle meat, you are eating what is considered a high methionine food source. And excess methionine in animal models and also in humans has been shown to use up glycine. Glycine is a conditionally essential amino acid. When we get low in glycine, we don't make enough, and then we can't make other important compounds in our body that use glycine, specifically glutathione, which is a major antioxidant in the human body, and collagen. So if we get too much methionine, my concern is that we won't be able to make enough glycine to buffer the methionine and make glutathione and collagen. So I do recommend collagen supplementation in addition to the muscle meat to simulate eating tendons. If people have access to tendons, they don't need collagen. And that, the connective tissue part is bone broth, it's, collagen, or it's actual tendons. And that's just, again, it goes back to eating the whole animal. You're going to have a richer glycine source from the hide of the animal, from the connective tissue in the animal. You're not just going to eat the muscle meat. The tendons are hard to chew, but I think we would have boiled them or chewed on them or just swallowed them. They are nutrients. They're beneficial for us. So we're going to eat all the little grisly bits. We don't do that anymore, but we probably should. So now we have muscle meat, we have organ meat, we have omega-3/iodine source, we have connective tissue, which is a glycine source. And then the last thing is probably a source of calcium. And I think that humans need calcium for a variety of things. And that is where bone meal comes in. So I think that there's evidence that our ancestors actually ate bones. They ate the soft ends of bones. They're going to get bone meal by grinding some bones or by crunching on small bones, whether it's fish, eating small fish with all the bones in it, or just eating, I've heard of tribes actually just eating the whole bone. If it's a small bone, they'll just crunch it up in their mouth. So we have eaten bones, so we need calcium in our diets for a variety of things. And so I use bone meal as well. And there are, again, unique nutrients that are only found in the bones of an animal. Things like boron. Manganese is found in the liver, but boron is only found in the bones. Now, if you're eating a mixed diet, you can get boron from things like avocado. But if you're eating just nose-to-tail carnivore, not a lot of boron in a lot of in other places in the animal, and there's definitely no calcium. So those are pretty much all the areas. It's not as complex as this sounds. You just want to think, like, if you were going to eat an animal nose to tail, well, there's a bone there, there's a tendon there, there's an organ there, there's a muscle there, and there's a brain there. And that's pretty much going to get you everything you need long term.
I love it, man. And so where do people, because I'm interested in this salmon roe. I've heard you talk about it before. Is that just available at like a grocery store? Do you order that online?
You can get it online. Vital Choice sells it. I don't have any affiliation. I probably should at this point. And then also you can get Whole Foods often has it. It's precious. It's not cheap, but it's good. I get about a tablespoon a day.
Wow. And then what about the bone meal? How do you, well, one, where do you get that? And two, how do you incorporate that in? Do you just like mix it in your water?
Yep. I just mix it in water. I was getting it from a company that's now sold out. I think that I've recommended it too many times. But basically you just want to look for grass-fed bone meal. There's another company, Ancestral Supplements, that I have no affiliation with, that sells a bone meal product that people can find. It's actually ground up bones and calcium. And, interestingly, I had a client this morning that I was talking to, and she has oxalate issues. She's sensitive to oxalates, which are one of the toxins that are found in plants. And, she has been on a bunch of oxalate forums, and what they'll talk about on oxalate forums is dairy as a source of calcium to sort of mitigate oxalates, whether to bind them in the stomach or to help the body sort of process them and move them out of the body. I'm not a fan of dairy. That was one of the things that I left out of that description. I don't like dairy. I was talking to Danny Baig on his podcast about this. When people incorporate dairy, they seem to have increased weight gain, changes in satiety, probably due to casomorphin, which is an opiate-like compound in dairy. And then there are questions around whey and casein seen being very immunogenic in dairy. So I generally strongly recommend people they avoid dairy on a carnivore diet, at least in the beginning, to get a sense of what it's like without it. So what I recommended to her was, hey, you need bone meal. You need a calcium source as you are, getting rid of these oxalates, as you are sort of transitioning away from an oxalate diet. She's now doing a carnivore diet, but I recommended bone meal. So that's just one of the things. Calcium helps us deal with oxalates. Calcium, is involved in neuron transmission in the blood. Calcium is involved in our own bone homeostasis. Calcium is involved in many processes in the body. One of the things that came up in the debate with Lane Norton was these ideas of meat being carcinogenic or heme iron being carcinogenic. And the only studies that have been done that show heme iron contributing to precancerous lesions in the colon of mice were done in calcium deficient mice. So they have to make the mice calcium deficient in order to allow for heme iron to have any sort of tumorigenic effect. So there are studies in humans that suggest that calcium supplementation may benefit from a colonic adenoma perspective. So it's doing a lot of things, calcium. We know we need it. There have been people in carnivore communities that have suggested that we don't need calcium, and I just think, what are you talking about? There have been videos done by people on YouTube who said, oh, I have a calcium normal level that's normal, and I haven't eaten calcium in years. And I'm thinking, that's a serum calcium level. And the serum calcium level is very tightly regulated and is not a good indication of total body calcium stores. So that's a very dangerous thing, to just not be having calcium for years and years and years. You really can't get a sense of your total calcium levels unless you do parathyroid hormone and a bunch of other studies of calcium. So anyway, we benefit from having calcium, in my opinion.
Now, can you supplement directly with calcium, or is there better bioavailability from something like bone meal?
The thing about bone meal is that it carries with it all of these evolutionary benefits, right? You're getting calcium hydroxyapatite, which is a very highly bioavailable form. You're also getting strontium, vanadium, the manganese, boron, all these other things that are in bone. I don't like calcium supplements, and in general, I try to get my clients off all their supplements for a variety of reasons, but I'm not a big fan of calcium supplements. There have been meta-analyses done that show that calcium supplementation is associated with a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. Now, a meta-analysis is a sort of summary of a number of epidemiologic trials. So these are not direct intervention trials. They look at people over time, and they look to see who is taking calcium supplements and the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And there is an association there. They can't prove causality, but I think that what that's indicating, number one, is that calcium supplements are not a great idea, and that if you try and separate a mineral from the tissue in the animal in which it's normally found, you are also going to miss the cofactors. And the cofactors may help us process it. Specifically, what I think that those meta-analyses with calcium and increased rates of cardiovascular disease reflect is pervasive deficiency of vitamin K2 and vitamin D in our society. Vitamin K2 is menaquinone, it's MK4, MK7, MK11, all these different forms of vitamin K2, but vitamin K2 is richly found in animal meats. Nobody's going to get K2 deficient if they're eating animals nose to tail. It's in the liver. It's even in the muscle meat. And, but if people are only getting K1, which is phyloquinone from plants, and they don't convert it to K2 well, then they could be deficient in vitamin K2. And if they're deficient in vitamin K2 and taking excess calcium, it's like we're sort of short-circuiting it all, right? If we eat the whole animal, we have everything there we need for it, which is, again, it's the ultimate multivitamin. You have all these things that are going to help the way all these other minerals are processed. The fat-soluble vitamins are there with the minerals, and things are there in the right ratios. We can talk about copper and zinc as well, which is an interesting story. But this is why I don't like multivitamins from supplements, and why I generally am very leery of supplements in people in general, is that once you start doing a supplement, you are sort of deconstructing a very complex system, and you have to really make sure you're doing everything else right. People over-supplement with magnesium, they get deficient in calcium. People over-supplement with zinc, they get deficient in copper. But if you just can construct a good diet, it's pretty incredible, and there's a lot of beautiful elegance in the way it all kind of works. I mean, it's overly simplified, but it's a pretty neat concept.
No, I 100% agree. That's a brilliant way of putting it. I got to ask this question because I know people are thinking about it and it's going to get brought up about it's like you brought up like the meat and cancer association that's there. What about overcooking meat? I know a lot of people talk about like, well, what happens because everyone probably loves bacon. So what happens when like bacon turns black or you start doing that? What is there any association there? Is there any problems or things to be worried about in that regard?
There are, and I'm going to burst a couple people's bubbles here, but so there's a couple of nuances here to discuss. The first thing we'll talk about are advanced glycation end products, and then we can talk about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines. And those are two different sets of things. So advanced glycation end products occur in the production of all sorts of foods, meat and plant foods. There are charts online, and some of the foods with the highest amount of advanced glycation end products are things like roasted nuts, when nuts are roasted in oil, but bacon is quite high in advanced glycation end products, as is butter. And the units of it are like milliunits per liter or something. It's just sort of like an endogenous unit for advanced glycation end products. But there have been lots of studies that associate higher levels of AGEs with progression of diabetes, worsening of aging, fragility of arteries, things like this. So regardless of where we are getting advanced glycation end products from, we want to be aware of that and limit them. So I am not a big fan of bacon for a couple of reasons. Bacon is basically deep fried meat, and bacon has gotten this rap as like, it's okay to eat bacon, love your bacon. And yeah, it's very delicious, but you're taking a fatty meat and you're cooking it in its own fat. You're basically deep frying fat in fat. And when you do that, you're creating advanced glycation end products. So if you take a steak and you put the steak in a bunch of tallow in the pan, you're going to create advanced glycation end products on the steak. So I don't recommend cooking meats in oil, or at least being aware that if you are cooking a meat in oil, you're kind of frying the meat, right? And that is going to create advanced glycation end products. That's going to lead toward the Maillard reaction, which is the reaction by which AGEs are formed. So cooking meats in oil, whether it's bacon frying in its own grease, people cooking a steak in a shitload of tallow, this is not the way to do it from an AGE perspective, right? But again, there are many advanced glycation end products in all sorts of other foods, right? So this is not unique to animal foods. It's in plenty of other foods. People can get a huge dose of AGEs by eating like browned, encrusted foods, things like that. That's also a caveat to that is the substance acrylamide, which is not formed on animal products to the same extent that it's formed on plant products. So acrylamide is generally a carbohydrate formed substance that is carcinogenic, that's found in things like coffee and browned breads and things like that. So there are plant equivalents of many of these compounds too. Basically what we're seeing is that when you cook anything, whether it's a croissant or a bagel or coffee and you roast it, there are some of these compounds that get formed and you need to understand how to mitigate them. So I'm not a fan of eating grains or cooked breads or coffee, so that gets rid of most of the acrylamide, but people need to know that it's there if they're consuming those things. The AGEs are formed in these deeply fried kind of browned foods, whether it's a nut or bacon, things like this, or butter has a lot of AGEs. And the other thing I don't like about bacon is that it almost invariably it has celery powder in it, which kind of segues into the idea of nitrates. I'll just sidestep for 1 minute and leave people with this curiosity about nitrates. So nitrates are precursors to N-nitroso compounds, which have been associated with precancerous lesions in the gut, but nitrates generally are mostly found in plants. And there actually have been recommendations in the past for pregnant women to avoid eating high nitrate vegetables because these nitrates in plants can contribute to these N-nitroso compounds. So no one ever talks about nitrates, but nitrates are added to bacon, whether it's celery powder or whether it's sodium nitrite, as preservatives. So you're not getting around it when you're eating celery powder. So you're still getting nitrates, and generally I think we want to avoid those. There was a really interesting study that got published I saw Sean Baker talking about on Instagram recently that looked at people who had incidents of glioblastoma multiforme, which is a very severe brain cancer. And again, it was epidemiology, but in the people that had higher amounts of plant nitrates in their diet, there was a strong association. I think the hazard ratio was 1.5 So like a 50% increase in the incidence of glioblastoma multiforme in patients who had high plant nitrate diets. Animal-based nitrates were not associated with the same thing. So it's crazy. Like the plant nitrates are a problem. Anyway, that's celery powder. That's in bacon. 2 strikes against bacon. There's a lot of people crying when they're listening to this right now. I'm so sorry. It's not that you can't ever have it. I just want you to know, truth is, knowledge is power. You want to know it. You can make the decision whether you want to eat it or not. Then the third thing, I'm sorry for this long-winded explanation, is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines. These are like the things that are formed when you burn a steak, right? When you brown and burn a steak. And the research I've seen on these suggests that levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are able to be dealt with by the body and are only shown to contribute to precancerous lesions when they're in their highest concentrations, and that is associated with extremely browned and burned ground beef. So if you just throw a steak on a pan and you brown the outside a little bit, that's probably not going to create enough polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons to create a problem long term. If you really want to mitigate polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heterocyclic amines, you can do things like stews, pressure cookers, sous vide, and you can use a non-plastic sous vide bag. Sous vide is low temperature cooking. It's not going to form really any of these. So there are ways to mitigate this. I said this in the debate with Lane. There's a real distinction here between the fact that animal foods do not have any intrinsic toxins in them. We may create low levels of toxins in animal foods based on the way we cook them. This is in stark contrast to plant foods, which are riddled with, plant toxins that are made by the plants. No matter how we cook them, a lot of them are stable. So the real difference here. So people should know that animal foods are not intrinsically toxic. The way you prepare them needs to be intentional, and that only the highest levels of PAH, heterocyclic amines, have been shown to be associated with precancerous lesions, and that requires basically burning ground beef in a pan and really, really cooking the heck out of it. So you can sous vide, you can do pressure cooking, you can brown a steak lightly. It's not a big deal. If you burn a steak, you can cut the burn part off. But, I don't recommend people cooking steaks in deep amounts of oil. That's going to create AGEs. Or if you're doing it, just know you're doing it and be aware of what you're doing. But if you want to avoid that, that's how you do it. I don't cook my steaks in oil. I'll use either a cast iron pan that's already pre-seasoned and I'm not going to add any oil to it, and I'll just get a pan hot and just sear it on both sides lightly, or I'll sous vide it or something, or I'll use a pressure cooker.
No, that's fascinating. That's really, really interesting. Now, I'm going to ask you about, I assume that you probably eat, like if you go out and you order a steak, you probably order it like medium rare.
Like as rare as I can get it.
As rare as you can get it. Now, the question becomes, is it possible, and or why hasn't anyone done this? And this is an experiment a very good friend, Sean Wells of mine, wants to do, is why not go carnivore but just go raw? Like why not just go just raw meat? Is that feasible, and would there be any upside or downside to that?
It's totally feasible. Of course, when we're talking raw and you're talking to a physician, you have to talk about foodborne illness, right? So, there's the difference between ground beef and steak is that the inside of a steak is not going to have any bacteria on it. The outside of a steak could have bacteria on it. Probably not, but it could. And so I don't think it's anything to really worry about. But if people, they don't know where that steak has been. Like, are you going to wash that steak off? Like, how are you going to sterilize that steak? From a sterility standpoint, from a health standpoint, you could have E. coli, 0157 on the outside of your steak and you could get sick, but when you sear it in the pan, you're going to kill that, right? So who knows? We eat sushi raw. It's probably fine for us. There's not a lot of tapeworms or parasites that live inside of ruminant muscle meat. Pigs are monogastric. They're different. You can't eat raw pork because you could get a pork tapeworm, but raw ruminant meat is pretty darn safe. You just have to know what's on the outside of it and where it's been. I eat raw liver, but what I've done with the raw liver is I've frozen it for a couple weeks to kill anything. It's not common to have anything, but that's what they do with sushi. So people may know this. In order to serve sashimi salmon in a restaurant, that salmon has to be deep frozen. It is illegal to serve fresh sashimi salmon because of the tapeworm called Diphyllobothrum latum which is in like a lot of Pacific salmon. So if people are ever out fishing for salmon, you do not want to eat raw salmon out of the ocean. There's a lot of tapeworms in salmon. So cooking clearly has its benefits from an infectious disease, parasitic, bacterial perspective. But then the question becomes, how much do you lose when you cook it? And I don't think you lose much when you just sear the outside of a steak, right? And I tend to like the flavor of that. I've definitely eaten raw meat. It's not as palatable. It's not as good, man. Have you tried it?
Yeah, I'm with you.
It's just not as good. Like I've heard actually people say that humans have developed this taste for the sear on a steak, and like there's something nice about the crust on a steak. And I don't know whether it's that we like something that's not good for us because we're liking that small amount of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon or what, but I like cooked meat more. I'm very careful not to overcook my meat. And I've done testing on myself looking at lipid peroxides and levels of DNA damage, and those all look really good on a carnivore diet, incidentally. So I'm not worried about that per se. But yeah, I think for me, I prefer to eat liver raw because I want to save any of the vitamin C that's in there and any of the nutrients in liver. I eat egg yolks raw. I don't eat the whites because of the avidin in the white, which can bind biotin. So I just discard egg whites. It also appears to me that I'm immunologically sensitive to egg whites. They do tend to trigger a little bit of eczema for me. And that was one of the reasons I decided to go full carnivore, was to really see if I could completely get rid of my eczema, which I was able to do, which was pretty awesome. When I cut out everything and was able to stop all of my supplements with all the binders and silicon dioxide, different story. But yeah, so I think that a raw foods, animal-based diet is reasonable, but I don't think it's necessary. But there are people that do it. I don't think we have to do that. But I eat a lot of foods raw. I mean, I eat raw liver. I eat raw egg yolks. I'm not really worried about them. I freeze the liver. The egg yolks are sterile. And any danger on an egg is going to be on the shell. So any Campylobacter or Salmonella is on the shell of an egg. So when I crack the egg and the shell never touches the yolk, I'm not really worried about it contaminating it. But yeah, it's an interesting thing.
So what does a day look like for you? What does a day look like in Paul's life of what you typically eat?
So I get up in the morning. I usually eat 2 meals a day. Okay. I get up in the morning and I generally eat 2 meals a day, and it's usually breakfast and a late lunch. And then I have a fasting window. I don't usually eat dinner. I find that I sleep better when I skip dinner. So I get up in the morning, I have a big amount of water, and I kind of like wait a little bit, maybe do a little work for an hour or something, and then eat breakfast around 9 o'clock or 8:30. And breakfast is salmon roe. It's raw liver. It's raw duck egg yolks right now. And it's going to be grass-fed steak with sea salt and beef tallow and collagen. And that's about it. So that's what, and generally it's not super exciting, but I will rinse and repeat later in the day. I'll do more grass-fed steaks with tallow and collagen and sea salt and maybe some more salmon roe and maybe some more egg yolks and maybe some more liver, and it may vary. If I'm out at the coast surfing, I may get some oysters and eat raw oysters, or, if I'm out with friends, maybe I'll get a piece of wild salmon or something, and I have to be very careful about how it's cooked. I'm pretty distinct about that. I want to know what the animal's cooked in. I'm not going to eat an animal that's cooked in vegetable oil. I'm pretty sensitive to that. So, but yeah, I mean, it will vary every once in a while. But when I'm in my environment, I think I'm a person that likes routine. I like not having to think about my food. I enjoy my meals. One of the things that's crazy about a carnivorous diet like that is people imagine that must get so boring. And for myself and a lot of other people, it's just not. It's just a crazy thing. Like when you get to eat steak all the time, it just never gets boring. So when I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, it was amazing how many foods got to be boring that I did not expect to be boring. So, in my previous life, I liked peanut butter, and I think most of us probably just gorged on peanut butter at different times in our lives and thought this is the best food ever. Peanut butter got freaking boring on the Pacific Crest. I was like, I don't want to eat peanut butter. The only foods that I did not get bored of on the Pacific Crest Trail were animal meat and, some kind of fat, like tallow or something, So like I always wanted to eat hamburgers. At the time I was eating the bun too, but I could always eat a hamburger. I could always eat a steak. I could always eat jerky on the Pacific Crest Trail. Animal meat never got boring. Eggs never got boring, but all the plant foods got boring unless they were completely processed garbage. And admittedly, 20 years ago in my life when I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, I was eating Pop-Tarts, Oh, so yeah. that's my mulligan. And I mean, Pop-Tarts, maybe they would also have gotten boring, but I think that's the magic of the insidious magic of processed food is it doesn't get boring in the same way that like peanut butter just got freaking boring.
Right.
I don't want this, but I never got bored of meat, and I still haven't gotten bored of meat. I've been, strict carnivore for pretty much 8 months now, and I never think, damn it, I have to eat a steak.
Right.
Damn it, more stamina.
More full. Yeah, I love it. Now, question for you: Is there a benefit? Because this is something I always had. Would you, if someone were going carnivore, would you prefer them to go with a leaner cut of meat and add fat on top of it, or just a fattier cut of meat?
I think that the latter is probably better, but it depends what you can get because the leaner cuts of meat are often more affordable. So you can do it both ways, and there's a couple of things that we should address here for people. So you could do like a sirloin steak or a skirt steak or, a roast. It's going to be leaner, that's fine, and then you can add fat to it. But the protein to fat macro is really important because the one thing that we haven't really talked about thus far is the fact that people who end up eating too much protein don't feel good, and that it's very individual how much fat we need, but we know from Arctic explorers and cases of things like, rabbit starvation that we benefit from having fat in our diet. We need fat. So this is not really a question, and I generally aim for about 50-50 in terms of grams in a day, fat to protein. Probably often I'm getting a little more protein than fat in a day. I think that I'm probably getting 200 to 250 grams of protein and probably 200 grams of fat in a day, just as an estimate. But if people are just eating lean meat and they're not eating fat and they're feeling horrible, well, I can tell you why. It's that your biochemistry needs fat. Like we do not run on protein as a fuel. We run on fat as a fuel or carbohydrates. But if we're doing a low carb diet and we're not going to run on carbohydrates, we need fat for fuel. People sometimes want to lose weight, and in that case, you could eliminate some fat or you could cut it down. But and then presumably you will use your own fat to do beta oxidation. But if you're lean or at the body composition that you want, limiting fat is not a good idea. And there are versions of a carnivorous diet, like the Paleolithic ketogenic diet popularized by this group in Hungary, that have a much higher fat ratio. They want to have 2-to-1 fat to protein in terms of grams in a day, which is like something like 70 to 80% of your calories are coming from fat. I think 1-to-1 in grams is fine, which will end up giving you like 65% of your calories from fat. Most people believe that humans can easily tolerate 35% of their calories from protein, maybe 40, maybe 50%, but much above 50% of our calories from protein we don't do so good on. So just so people don't get lost here, I'm kind of mixing my units here. I'm talking about calories and I'm talking about grams. Protein is essentially 4 calories per gram. Some people say it's less because of the thermic effect of protein. Some people say it's like 3 calories per gram, but 3 to 4 calories per gram of protein, 9 calories per gram of fat. So 35% of your calories from protein often leads to people eating 200 plus grams of protein a day on a carnivorous diet, which I think is probably optimal for a human, but there are versions of a carnivore diet that have much more fat and risks and benefits to all those things. So I think that the fat is really important and the macros are important. So I would, if you're thinking adding fat to lean meat or getting a fatty cut of meat, I would just get the fatty cut of meat because the fat that's on the animal I think is going to have unique benefits. It's less processed than a tallow that you're adding. I don't think people should be adding vegetable fats to their meat on a carnivore diet. I've seen people react to olive oil and coconut oil. Oleosins are protein-bound components of fat. So there are proteins in coconut oil that could be immunogenic. There are other things, so whatever. So if people are going to use animal fats, tallow is rendered and more processed than fat that's in an animal meat. So if I had a choice, it would be a fatty animal meat that I would be eating. But there are different ways to skin the cat. A lot of people end up with diarrhea or loose stool when they start a carnivore diet. This is a normal thing. It probably has to do with bile acids being secreted from the gallbladder in very high amounts and the inadequate ability of the small intestine to resorb those because it's not used to it. Most people have this resolved within 2 to 3 weeks. It's not a dangerous thing. It's an adjustment phase to a carnivore diet. But in those cases, the tallow, the rendered fats can sometimes cause more loose stool. So you kind of have to be careful of that.
For sure. And we're kind of rounding this out. I want to be conscious of your time because I know you're busy, but I want to talk a little bit about fiber, because a lot of times people go, well, you need fiber in order to get satiation. Like there's a satiety factor with fiber. What are your thoughts on that, and what would you say to like counter, like, no, you don't need fiber?
Yeah, I'm laughing because like I love talking about fiber. There is no need for fiber in the human diet, and there are a million studies to prove this. And I debated this at length with Lane. I would refer people to that, but I'll try and break it down briefly here. So the fiber is a delusion that was given to us through the stories of a guy named Burkitt, who was a physician in the 1960s and 1970s, and he went to Africa. I believe it was Tanzania, and at that time, the surgeons were seeing a lot of this outpouching of the colon called diverticulosis, which is when the submucosal layer of the colon moves through the muscularis mucosa. And so in the westernized populations in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of that happening. And this guy went to Tanzania and he studied the people there, and he said, oh, there's no diverticulosis here. What's the difference? And they were eating a lot of fiber, probably because it was, they were at the time when they couldn't access as many animals and they were relying on tubers. And this is not an argument for fiber or tubers in the human diet. It's just what was happening to those people. So they were eating a lot of fiber, and he described, them having these large bowel movements, and that became the norm because he incorrectly associated the large amount of fiber in their diet with an absence of diverticulosis. The problem is that when we have continued to study this, what we see is that doesn't work. And that connection does not hold true in actual research studies. So there are a number of studies that have been done. I can, tell people the titles if they want, but there are a number of studies that have been done that show that when we look at populations of humans and we look at the amount of fiber in their diet, and then we look at the amount of diverticulosis, in most of the studies that have been done, there's no association between fiber and diverticulosis. And in some of the studies, the more fiber someone eats, the more fiber someone eats, the more diverticulosis they have. So this is a crazy thing that when we look through epidemiology, one of the studies is called A High Fiber Diet Does Not Protect Against Asymptomatic Diverticulosis. And it was a cross-sectional epidemiology study. They looked at diverticulosis and fiber intake, and they saw no protection from fiber. A high fiber diet increased the frequency of bowel movements, but it was associated with a greater rather than a lower prevalence of diverticulosis. And this was done, they did both epidemiology and studies where they looked at people's colons with colonoscopy. So this kind of flies in the face and totally breaks the Burkitt's hypothesis. So fiber doesn't prevent diverticulosis. Kind of begs the question, what does cause diverticulosis? I think that the understanding now is that diverticulosis is probably an autoimmune disease. We see lymphocytic infiltration into diverticuli in the gut, and so we see lymphocytes in there. So I would argue that diverticulosis is autoimmune. That's a fairly controversial hypothesis, but I think that there's evidence to support that. And if we're thinking autoimmune, then we have to go back to the idea that what is triggering autoimmunity? I would argue it's probably plants, but there's all sorts of, pros and cons to that, because we didn't see a lot of diverticulosis in the African populations who were presumably eating plants. So something was triggering diverticulosis in us, and it could have just been westernized foods and things that were triggering, but it's not fiber that's protective, that's for sure. So fiber doesn't protect us from diverticulosis. And then you can talk about fiber and satiety, and if you look at the studies, they don't hold up. So this study is called Fermentable and Non-Fermentable Fiber Supplements Did Not Alter Hunger, Satiety, or Body Weight in a pilot study of men and women consuming self-selected diets. So in the research that's been done, fiber doesn't result in satiety. It doesn't protect against diverticulosis. It might cause diverticulosis, or it's been associated, but we don't know for sure. And the other misconception is that fiber is going to protect us from colon cancer. Well, that doesn't hold up in the literature either. So we're just knocking them down here. there are a number of studies that have been done in the New England Journal of Medicine from the late 1990s. Lack of effect of a high fiber cereal supplement on the recurrence of colorectal adenomas. And there was another one where they looked at they had people include more fruits and vegetables in their diet, and neither of those studies showed any benefit to the recurrence of colorectal adenomas in those populations. The other study, dietary fiber, the risk of colorectal cancer and adenoma in women. The conclusion, no protective effect of dietary fiber was observed when we omitted adjustment for total energy intake. Our data do not support the existence of an important protective effect of dietary fiber against colorectal cancer or adenoma. So, all right, it doesn't help with diverticulosis. It doesn't help with cancer. It may worsen diverticulosis in some people. It definitely worsens constipation and gas in a lot of people. And it doesn't help with satiety. The decreases in LDL cholesterol are essentially nominal, 3 milligrams per deciliter. The decreases in blood pressure are also nominal, maybe 2 to 3, 4 millimeters of mercury. So it's pretty wild. And then if you think about it, the other thing that fiber is prescribed for is constipation. But there are multiple studies which show that when we remove fiber from the diet, constipation gets better. So there's a study, I'm trying to find it here. It's a pretty famous one where they took 46 people and they removed fiber from one of the groups. And what they found was complete resolution of gas, bloating, and constipation in the zero fiber group. So just totally flies in the face of everything we've been told with regard to fiber. So if we really, really look at the data, that study is in the World Journal of Gastroenterology, and I think it's called Removal of Dietary Fiber Leads to Improvement in Constipation. I'm going to find you the exact title.
Now, one of the questions people might have, and I know I've had this question come up, is twofold. So people who are overweight, obese, tend to have problems with portion sizes, right? So they're used to eating a large amount, but if they go just straight carnivore, they might only be eating 4 to 6 ounces of meat, whereas they're losing potentially some roughage that they're getting with a side salad or something to help increase the volume of their food. What are some things you say would combat that, or would being in a state of ketosis and just being carnivore in general combat that?
Meat is incredibly satiating. Meat is incredibly satiating. And, Ted Naiman has a protein leverage hypothesis, which is a hypothesis, but the idea is that perhaps satiety is based on a need for protein and that we will keep eating until we get a certain amount of protein. Not everybody agrees with this. I think Lane would strongly disagree with that. But, I think that what people will find outside of dairy is that animal foods are incredibly satiating and that they will not have trouble with portion control when they are eating an animal-based diet. It's a non-issue because it's probably leptin and ghrelin and satiety mechanisms. One could argue insulin is involved, though insulin is probably it's not as simple an equation as we believe it to be regarding insulin causing issues and things like this. And I know that there's a lot of debate about that, but insulin is probably involved at least somewhat. There's ghrelin, there's leptin, but when people try this, they will find that an animal-based diet is incredibly satiating and they will not have to worry about portion sizes, eating beyond satiety, and there's no need for fiber. And in fact, as the studies would suggest, fiber may not actually be that satiating. And if we're really just looking for satiety, it reminds me of a story one of my friends told me when he was an Army Ranger. They were starved for days and they would just eat toilet paper and then drink water to fill their stomach. And it's if that's all we're doing with fiber, there's no benefit to that and there's potential harm. Some people fear that if we're eating all this insoluble fiber, that it's going to be abrasive for the inside of our gut. So just eating toilet paper, just eating insoluble fiber, just eating roughage, you might as well go eat sticks and leaves, just to put something in your stomach. That doesn't mean it's good for you, right? It's about satiety, and I think that there's hypotheses around protein, leptin, ghrelin, and animal foods are far and away the most satiating foods, whether it's animal fat or animal protein, people will not have a problem with that at all. The study regarding constipation is called Stopping or Reducing Dietary Fiber Intake Reduces Constipation and its Associated Symptoms. It's quite a striking study. So yeah, that kind of hopefully is a good fiber discussion for people. For sure. Any notion that fiber is beneficial in any way for humans is simply not supported by the evidence, and I enjoyed disabusing Lane Norton of that notion greatly.
Last two questions. So what would you say to people, and I've actually responded to people on this question really from a ketogenic standpoint, but I'm curious to hear your thought. A lot of times people talk about fiber, particularly like some of these prebiotic fibers, maybe like chicory root or inulin, which for me, they like mess up my stomach pretty bad. But a lot of people talk about like the benefits of butyrate, because when you eat fiber, you produce butyrate. What would you say to that of like, oh, well, like, yeah, there might be some pros to production of butyrate, but is there other ways to get that production on a carnivorous diet? What would kind of be some of your thoughts?
Absolutely. So this is another often repeated, widely misunderstood notion in the popular literature that butyrate is perhaps the only short-chain fatty acid, which is not true, and that we need fiber to make short-chain fatty acids. So this is misinterpretation of the biochemistry and the physiology. So short-chain fatty acids are molecules, of which butyrate is one, and when we eat fiber, some of the colonic bacteria do make butyrate, which can serve as a food fuel for the colonic epithelial cells. However, when we do not eat fiber, we are able to use protein and fat to make other short-chain fatty acids, specifically propionate and isobutyrate and acetate, which can equally substitute as short-chain fatty acids for these colonic epithelial cells. So there's nothing unique about butyrate in this situation. We don't need butyrate. We can make it from protein and fat as well. So basically, no matter what you eat, your body is going to make short-chain fatty acids. The other issue is that ketosis provides beta-hydroxybutyric acid in the bloodstream, and that every cell in the colon lining has a blood supply through which it's going to get a ketone body or multiple ketone bodies, which it can use to run its cellular machinery. So the idea that fiber is necessary for colonic epithelial cell metabolism is false. That is a misunderstanding. There's also been an often repeated study from the Journal of Cell, quoted by Stephen Gundry and quoted by Rhonda Patrick, saying that if you don't eat fiber, the bacteria in your gut are going to digest the mucus layer in your gut, and that is going to cause problems with inflammation in the gut. And the problem with this paper is, or there are many problems, but this is a misinterpretation of what's happening in this paper. So when Rhonda Patrick and Stephen Gundry say this, there is one paper that showed this. It was done in mice, and the mice were raised without any microbiota. So they were gnotobiotic, G-N-O-T-O biotic mice. Then they were given a human-like microbiome containing 14 species. So the whole model of this is quite contrived. Our microbiome has over 1,000 species, some of which are going to vary based on our diet. If we don't eat a diet that's high in fiber, we're going to move more toward bile acid-liking organisms. We're going to move more toward organisms that will ferment protein and fat. Okay, so they gave the mice a carbohydrate-liking microbiome of only 14 microorganisms, and then they starved the mice of fiber. And they said, okay, we're going to give this mice fiber, and we're going to give these mice no fiber. And what they saw was a slight reduction in the amount of mucus layer in the fiber-free diet, but what they note in the study is that there was no change in the histopathology. So they admit, albeit without histopathologic changes. So they have this contrived mouse model, and they see the mucus go down, but there are no changes of pathology in the colonic epithelial cells when they look at a histopathologic level. So it really bothers me when people parrot this information and they say, you need fiber or you're going to digest the mucus in your gut. Well, that's never been proven. And clinically, we don't see that either, because what we're seeing with people on carnivore diets is that they have very healthy guts. there are a number of clients I work with that have done things like uBiome and Viome or GI map testing, and we see very high alpha diversity. We do not see inflammation. We do not see elevated calprotectin. And these are all clinical markers that we would expect to see in people if they actually had GI epithelial inflammation. I mean, basically what the mouse study is suggesting is that people would develop a pre-inflammatory bowel disease type condition, and that is not what's happening. People are not getting bloody stool and Crohn's and ulcerative colitis on carnivore diets. They're having perfectly healthy gut microbiota. But it kind of goes back to this idea that we're just so conditioned to believe that we need plants that we can't imagine that, hey, we are completely evolutionarily designed to live without them, probably more optimally. We didn't even really get into, the ins and outs of plant toxins, but I've spoken about that on other podcasts, and people can look at my Instagram. I posted a lot about the fact that there are myriad plant toxins, whether we're talking about lectins, oxalates, phytoestrogens, whether we're talking about phytohemagglutinins, we're talking about plant antigens, which can cause issues, and then endogenous plant pesticides, there's thousands, all these molecules that plants make that are made by the plant. They're sort of plant-produced pesticides, and they've been shown to be either toxic in rodents or actually cause chromosomal breaks when they're studied on human studies. So this is a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down, in the future about all the toxins that are in plants. And that's what's so cool about a carnivore diet is you can get all the things you need without the plant toxins.
Fascinating, man. And I definitely am going to have to get you back on here, and I'll link to all those videos. Your videos on YouTube are phenomenal and absolutely incredible. So I appreciate the science you bring in, combined, like you said, with some anecdote, because I think both of those are important and they feed off each other. So
people have to hear the stories, yeah.
They have to. And so I want to ask you a question. You might be like, I'd rather take death. But if it was between, like, you had to eat, if you had to pick one fruit or vegetable to have, or death, like that was your two options, would there be something that you're like, you know what, this is probably the best option that's out there as far as fruit or vegetable? Or would you be like, you know what, I'd rather just call it quits?
No, I'm definitely not that crazy about it. I mean, I don't eat any plants because I don't feel like they serve a unique role, but one of the questions I often get asked is like, what are the least toxic plants? And right now I feel like the least toxic plants are probably non-sugary fruits. And by that I mean things like avocado, cucumber, if you remove the seeds and the skin from the cucumber. What else is a non-sugary fruit? There was another one that I was thinking of. I mean, but people will know, anything with a seed is a fruit. So like a squash, it's a carbohydrate source, so it's probably not great. But, I was thinking maybe white rice, but then, the more I thought about it, there's a lot of really potentially triggering lectins in white rice. So I think that if we're thinking about plants, the most highly immunogenic parts of a plant are the seeds, which include the nuts, seeds, and nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes. They're all seeds. And then, you get to the stems and roots and leaves, and those are all the very highly defended parts of a plant. So if we're eating a fruit of a plant, like an avocado, and it's not sugary, then, it's like, oh, that's probably not as bad as many of the other things. But that list is pretty short, Right. Especially if you're trying to stay in ketosis or you don't want to have a high carbohydrate diet. If you don't worry about carbohydrates, then, a squash is probably pretty benign. I mean, I've, as recently as probably 2 years ago or a year ago, I really enjoyed like kabocha squash, and I think that's a pretty benign thing. People have to be careful of some of the tubers. They are high in glycoalkaloids, especially things like cassava. Those can be really high in glycosides and glycoalkaloids, which are pretty toxic. But squash are technically a fruit. So like a non-sugary fruit, I mean, technically a squash is going to have complex carbs, but like a squash or an avocado is more benign, in my opinion, at this moment than many other things. So that would probably be like, some of the intermediate things. So if I were like starving and I was like, I'm going to die. I mean, that's the other thing that we didn't talk about is my perspective that like humans are probably, I would argue that humans are facultative carnivores, meaning that we can eat plants during times of starvation, and that may have been the role. I believe that was the role that plants have served for us during our evolution, that plants were survival food. Plants are not optimal Food for humans, that's animals. But we are so well adapted that we can use plants as survival food during those periods. And, if I were in a survival situation and somebody's like, here's an avocado, I'd be like, thank you. That's amazing. I'd be like, screw this. But it's a survival food. And I mean, a squash, that's a survival food. Those don't have all the micronutrients that we have in animals. And I think long term, if you just ate avocados, you're going to get deficiencies. Long term, if you eat meat and avocados, you're probably going to do just fine. I mean, some people might react to avocados as well, but we have to think about plants as survival food. Animals is like the real optimal foods.
Awesome, man. I think you just, over this last hour and a half, you just blew so many minds, including mine, and it's good. I'm glad you finished that way. I was hoping you'd say avocado, because that's basically my diet. Like it's really just meat and avocado. That's
way worse, my friend.
That's good. I'm on the right path. So, with that being said, I also want to talk to you. I want to get my results first, and then I'll probably message you and talk about it. But I think a lot of times people in this carnivore space aren't talking about something that I'm fascinated with and curious about, and that's deuterium. I don't know if you've done any insight into deuterium, but
Sure.
I think there's an immense benefit from that standpoint. If you're eating like grass-fed meat, lowering deuterium, it's one of the lowest amount of deuterium foods, and I think a lot of people in the carnivore space don't even talk about that, but that's potentially one of the huge benefits of it.
I think it's a benefit as well. And then the people in the Juve, the near-infrared space are talking about deuterium now, and that near-infrared light may help mitigate that. But yeah, I think it's totally true. And I think that it's in its infancy from what I can tell.
Agreed.
I think some of the research is compelling, and the idea that there could be this heavy water molecule that then inhibits the motor in the mitochondria, this ATP hydrolysis motor, like that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that in a lot of diseases we are seeing diseases of mitochondria, and deuterium might be involved in that. And yeah, a carnivore diet is a low deuterium diet. So whether or not it's probably a combination of all these things: lectins, plant antigens, plant toxins, oxalates, deuterium, who knows? But it's like, well, it looks good to me from like every perspective. So I think it's amazing.
Amazing, man. Well, keep doing your thing. I love that you're getting more and more out there. Where can people find you? YouTube, Instagram, wherever else you are. Where can people find more about your work and what you're putting out?
Yeah. So if people want to work with me, I have a private practice in functional medicine. I see clients. They can send me an email at paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. I am on YouTube. I've got a YouTube channel that's at Paul Saladino MD. I've recently started doing interviews with people, so I'm started doing my own podcast thing in its infancy. On Instagram, I am at Paul Saladino MD. On Twitter, I am MD Saladino. On Facebook, I am Paul Saladino MD, and I have a Patreon page, which is Paul Saladino MD. So people can find me at all those places. I try to answer all my DMs on Instagram. Sometimes it gets overwhelming. If people really want to get in touch with me, they should send me an email and put something good in the subject line, or just put put steak is amazing in the subject line, or they want to work with me or something, and I'll get back to them.
That's awesome, man. And we'll post all those in the show notes so people can find it and get to it. But yeah, man, I really truly appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate all the work you're doing and getting it out there, and everything you're putting forth, man. Just keep rocking it. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I'm super grateful to be in the space. It's really fun right now.
Awesome, brother. Well, I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
All right, man.